Reggie Fils-Aimé, what a gaming icon. Who could forget this?
My name is Reggie. I'm about kicking ass, I'm about taking names, and we're about making games.
Or this.
My body is ready.
Or this.
If you're an owner of a Nintendo 3DS, or just thinking of becoming one. And really, if you're neither one yet, what's wrong with you?
If you don't know, Reggie was the president of Nintendo of America during some of the company's most impressive years. However, he wasn't really comparable to his contemporaries like Iwata, Miyamoto, or Sakurai. He wasn't a scrappy yet creative developer that helped produce some of the most industry-shifting games ever to be released, eventually working his way up the corporate ladder. No, Reggie is at his core just a businessman, something that gamers typically hate. Executives are constantly showing us that they care more about their bottom line than the experiences they actually provide to their consumers. And in turn, we have grown bitter of figureheads that have continually made huge promises, yet massively underdelivered. But Reggie was different. He came in at a time when Nintendo was finally starting to regain their footing in the industry, having only very recently changed hands away from old head descendants of the founding family that didn't really understand the evolving video game landscape. With his arrival, he also effectively became the new face of Nintendo for Western audiences, and gave fans a more personable facade to the company. Even when he ascended to meme status, he embraced that role. He knew what Nintendo was about and adopted their fun-loving nature, and people adored him for it. Plus, it certainly helped that many of the things he presented ended up actually living up to the hype. But now that he is retired, all we are left with is questions. Still, largely, none of us really know what he actually contributed as COO. That is, until Reggie recently published an autobiography, disrupting the game from the Bronx to the top of Nintendo. You better believe that the moment I saw this, I knew I had to pick up a copy, so let's talk about what I learned about the man, the myth, Reggie. Well, the book surprisingly opens up with him talking about the death of Satoru Iwata, the widely venerated past president of Nintendo. For context, I highly recommend you check out Gaming Historian's video about Iwata's life and work. He was truly a monumentally important person in video game history. While this introduction might seem abrupt, if not at the very least chronologically incorrect, this actually works super well to outline a lot of the core values that Reggie goes into more detail about later in the book. He also speaks on how his relationship with Iwata was one of both great professional respect and deep friendship. Both sentiments are evident between Iwata specifically asking to meet with Reggie in person to talk about high-level business on multiple occasions, to being the first person to visit Iwata after his initial cancer treatment. I will admit, I definitely teared up at Reggie describing the day of the funeral. It's clear how much they cared for each other and how their relationship both within the company and outside of it was genuine. But thankfully, after this depressing preface, Reggie starts to tell his life story from the very beginning. His family was originally from Haiti, and they were quite impressive. One of his grandfathers eventually became the second highest ranking officer in the Haitian military, while his other grandfather eventually became the Secretary of Health and Education for the Haitian government. However, as their government began to collapse, his family stood up to the corruption, but was exiled for it, forcing them to flee the country and immigrate to America. But unfortunately, it was out of the frying pan and into the oven for them. Settling down in the Bronx, Reggie's family experienced poverty in a very dangerous area. He even recounts his experience of casually walking by trails of blood outside his tenement building. Thankfully, they eventually moved to Long Island, but he then experienced a completely different end of the spectrum, being nearly the only poor black kid in a sea of privileged white people. Through all of this, he learned at a young age that life is tough, sometimes unforgivingly brutal, but it's all about working hard for opportunities to bear through that struggle. And as such, he ended up doing very well in school, applying himself in high-level courses and making big plans for college. Paying for university was still very much an issue, but he always found ways to fund his journey and ended up getting a business degree from Cornell. Reggie even ended up doing so well in school that he was offered a position as a brand manager at Procter & Gamble right out of college. As exclusive and prestigious as this opportunity was, this was actually very contrary to his initial plans of becoming a banker. But he quickly learned that he shouldn't look a gift horse in the mouth and ended up taking the job regardless. From here, Reggie grew rapidly. He learned how to be completely prepared and concise when it comes to proposing new business strategies. He learned about workplace culture and fit. He learned of the extremely competitive industry where everyone is constantly trying to move up the corporate ladder. He learned how to hire other people, most importantly, those with non-traditional backgrounds that could offer a level of diversity to a team. He learned about unfair promotions, possibly rooted in workplace racism, or maybe rooted in other less harmless reasons, but unfair nonetheless. He learned the importance of mentorship, repeatedly having good bosses that pushed him in the right directions. And unfortunately, he also ultimately learned about overstepping his boundaries and signing off on marketing strategies without proper protocol. Regardless of whether or not those ideas ended up being successful, that was inexcusable. And as such, Reggie eventually left P&G, spending the next decade or so jumping between companies like Pizza Hut, Panda Express, Guinness, Derby Cycle, and eventually VH1. VH1 was actually a very important experience for Reggie, as this was his introduction into the world of entertainment. However, this position challenged him like never before, mostly because he now lacked full control of business strategies that were largely dependent on whatever the creatives were able to come up with, not him. Nonetheless, Reggie was just as driven as ever and sought to add value to the company that wasn't even expected of him. One of his first initiatives was upgrading the company website, as it was for the most part just a slightly more expanded view of your typical TV guide. It lacked content or any real reason to stay on the site for an extended period of time. Interestingly, he attempted to change this by adding gaming content to it, and recruited the help of a few people from Vicarious Visions, one of the eventual developers of Guitar Hero. However, this project would unfortunately never see release, being cut short with the events of September 11th. I will talk more on this later because it is a significant moment in the book, but for now, let's keep moving. After a few years of being at VH1 and the world-shifting tragedy that was 9/11, Reggie wanted change. Finally, he gets a call from a Nintendo recruiter. For context, this was at a pivotal moment for the company. Sony had been attacking their main business hard. Between the overwhelming success of the original PlayStation and the even better reception of the PS2, Nintendo was threatened. Plus, the rise of the Xbox also presented a new player in the field to worry about. And when it came to what they themselves had to offer, the GameCube simply was not selling as well as it needed to. The only thing that was still wildly successful for them was the handheld Game Boy line of consoles, including the Game Boy Advance. But once again, Sony was right there to shoot down their stock price with the announcement of the PSP. It definitely seemed like Nintendo was in a bind. But after an intimate video interview with Satoru Iwata himself, Reggie was convinced that they actually were not all that concerned with Sony or Microsoft. Nintendo always had a way of doing their own thing, separate from their competitors, and now was no different. Reggie liked this confidence, and he also knew from personal experience with gaming that it could have a bright future, even if the current public perception of it wasn't great. He believed that the love for video games could be generational, and we all know he ended up being right. And so, despite rational hesitation from all of his past mentors, he ended up taking the job as Executive Vice President of Marketing for Nintendo of America. Reggie, as motivated as ever, made great efforts to assimilate into the company and get working on brand strategies as quickly as possible. One of his biggest goals from the very beginning was bringing back the former glory of the company, and he, along with others, worked to do this by completely upgrading how they presented at E3. If you happen to not know, E3, or the Electronic Entertainment Expo, is an annual gaming conference where every major player in the industry announces their big upcoming hardware and software releases. Even though E3 has struggled in recent years due to COVID, it has for a long time been the most important few days for the entire gaming industry's whole year. And so, as Reggie prepared for E3 2004, he looked back at previous presentations and felt that they lacked clear direction, value, and preparation. They needed to figure out what they wanted their audience to take away from this year's conference, things that would truly spark excitement both for their fans and retailers. They ended up doing that mainly with three things: the unveiling of the Nintendo DS, the announcement of the Wii, which they dubbed the Revolution at the time, and lastly, Reggie himself. As previously mentioned, he was an extremely important figure for the public eye, and this was the first time he would be introduced to the world. And man, what an entrance.
My name is Reggie. I'm about kicking ass. I'm about taking names. And we're about making games.
In fact, Reggie talks in great detail about how those first words were heavily revised and rehearsed. This wasn't just a bold executive trying to seem cool. This was a statement for Nintendo, one that would mark a new phase in their history of driving the industry forward, being aggressive, and taking the credit they rightfully deserved. And with the showing of their next-generation consoles, Nintendo began to foster a new ideology, one that fought to bring gaming into the mainstream audience. They saw that both Sony and Microsoft were chasing after diminishing returns of more processing power and better visuals, both of which limited their market and raised costs. But with the simplicity of things like the DS and Wii, they could make the average person see that games could be for everyone. And lo and behold, they were absolutely right! Both consoles sold exceedingly well, the public perception of gaming shifted completely, and the company saw some of its most prosperous years in decades. Even more exciting, after enough time of helping spearhead these meteoric successes, Reggie was eventually promoted to president of Nintendo of America. However, as successful as his first half with the company was, Nintendo would then experience some years of decline. The successor that was the 3DS struggled to find its footing for a long time, and the eventual Wii U was just a total market failure, especially when compared to the Wii. But they were able to take the lessons they learned from those and apply it to the release of the Switch, which has actually succeeded. All in all, Reggie's experience at Nintendo was quite the roller coaster, but I think in the end, he was able to prove his worth to not only the company, but us as well. Finally, we come back to the death of Iwata. Soon after his passing, Reggie realized that he wanted to put his focus elsewhere and decided to retire. Since then, he has returned to his alma mater to speak on his experiences and inspire the next generation. He has gone back to the Bronx to speak to more underserved areas, and he even joined the executive boards of companies like GameStop for a short period of time. And all of that brings us back to today. But you know what? I don't really care about any of that. All of what I have just shared could have easily been skimmed from Reggie's Wikipedia page. Sure, it's true that along the way, he also gives plenty of vague business advice and shares a few fun anecdotes of his experiences at Nintendo, but those aren't the things that stuck with me. So let's talk about what I actually feel like I learned from this. As I began to read this, I knew I was going in with a bias as someone who already adored Reggie as a spokesman for Nintendo, and in turn, I consciously realized that it would be wise to apply a healthy amount of skepticism. But as I continued to read, that suspicion festered into a few unfortunate feelings. Firstly, it became very evident throughout so much of this story that Reggie was always looking at his job purely as someone who provided value to a corporation through brand strategies that drove sales. And yes, that is at the end of the day the definition of a businessman, but he makes almost no effort to also humanize himself in any meaningful way. In fact, I would argue that he inadvertently did a very good job of once again proving how uncaring the corporate world can be. Let's take a look at some examples. One that sticks out is his experience of helping sell the Bigfoot pizza from Pizza Hut. Reggie talks about how this was a product that was intended to help families with little budget pay for big meals that could be enjoyed by all. And while that was a valiant effort, in reality, the product existed almost entirely just to combat their competitor, Little Caesars. In fact, when the Bigfoot pizza didn't work out, they abandoned it and quickly looked to overtake a different competitor, Papa John's. They didn't actually care about making quality pizza at a good price. They just cared about undercutting their competition. Let's even look at Iwata's funeral. While I do still believe that the relationship was genuine, somehow, Reggie's ending resolution after walking away from a good friend's casket was that he needs to think harder about his legacy and the future of his career. Really? And finally, let's round back to Reggie's response to 9/11. If anything, this is the most telling moment in the entire book. Reggie describes the morning of the tragedy, but instead of expressing his deep emotional feelings, he talks about following protocol, getting on a train as soon as possible, and how all of this affected business. For someone who was, at the time, working in New York, that's pretty cold. And doubling down, Reggie talks about his involvement with VH1's Concert for New York City, an event held to raise money for those affected by the attacks. And while on the one hand, we can once again look at that as a good cause, on the other hand, he still fails to focus basically at all on the emotional impact the tragedy had. In fact, Reggie does more to talk about him meeting his wife through the event than he does to talk about the reality of the situation. Clearly, the times when Reggie should make an effort to humanize himself and be more vulnerable, he doesn't. Another thing that became very obvious was that Reggie clearly wants to uphold a positive image of himself, even if that means bending the truth a little bit in his favor. He loves to claim that he helped garner the mainstream audience that Nintendo was building, but Obviously, things like the DS and Wii were in full development long before he showed up, and they definitely still would have been released and most likely still very successful had he not been there. It even seems like Reggie tries to not harp on his obvious involvement with the failure that was the Wii U. In fact, he even goes out of his way to claim that his biggest regret at Nintendo wasn't the Wii U, but was instead not getting the Wii down to $100 or launching the 3DS at $200, things he claims would have completely changed the outlook for those consoles. And while it is true that, yes, lower price points drive more sales, that's still a pretty bold claim nonetheless. But honestly, the most disappointing part about this book is that Reggie fails to focus basically at all on the one thing that could have made it a standout read, one that could have shed light on an experience that is truly unique to him, being the first prominent black figure in gaming. Basically, the only anecdote he gives in terms of this was a time when someone at E3 mistook him for a security guard, which he took as a valid microaggression, but that's kind of it. With all of that said, it seems like Reggie decided to take this opportunity to write just a business self-help book that feels like a carbon copy of every other business self-help book on the shelf. It reads as just another bland look at corporate America. But to be fair, that may have been exactly what he intended, which is why it lacks things like emotional vulnerability, talking about his failures, and his experiences as a black man. Although I also want to clarify that I understand the other reasons as to why Reggie may have ended up not only writing the book this way, but just being this way. I am not surprised that he did everything he could to be the best businessman, even if that meant overlooking the emotional impact his career-defining moments had. He probably felt encouraged to never return to the poverty he grew up with, and no matter what, always add value to the corporations that gave him a chance. And when it comes to the tragedies he faced, everyone deals with grief in their own ways, and if he deals with it by trying his best to move on, I can't fault him for that. I am not surprised that Reggie mostly glosses over his failures. When you write an autobiography, you typically like the idea of making yourself seem much better than you may actually be in real life. Plus, Reggie is aware that he has for a long time been a deeply loved figure, and I think this book is more or less just a way for him to keep that legacy alive by doing everything in his power to consciously shine light on his achievements while distancing himself from his failures. And I am not surprised that he does not fully detail his experience as a black man. He probably grew a sort of shell around talking about it, given what I imagine being black in America and dealing with the inevitable racism and hate will do to you, making you a little rigid when it comes to talking about it, especially in the corporate world. But nonetheless, all of this still feels like a missed opportunity to be fully open and talk about everything, including the good, the bad, and the ugly. So with all of that said, I'm a bit disappointed. After years of watching Reggie at E3, I want to believe in him. I want to believe that Reggie had a good balance of business strategy and emotional intelligence. I want to believe that he understands his own failures and isn't trying to undermine them. I want to believe that being black in a largely non-black dominated industry meant something significant to him. And while I for the most part still believe those things, this book made me question them at least a little bit. Believe me, I don't like feeling like I need to be skeptical, but these days, I feel as though it would be ignorant not to. But I also know that if Reggie was watching this, and he really is as impressive as he claims in this book, then he would understand my hesitation. So I leave you with this. Remember Reggie as he always was, a treasured face for Nintendo of America. But don't blindly trust that he was ever that far off from other company heads that we look down on.